Welcome to Polaris-Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri welcoming our viewers from around the world to the fourth season of these programs on China and the United States in the world. This program is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. As a reminder, PolarisLive.com is a commercial-free, viewer-supported channel. You can help us by subscribing to our YouTube channel and our newsletters at my website, kashmeri.com. My guest today, Jeffrey Reeves, is Associate Professor at the United States Naval War College and Senior Washington Fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. He specializes in Asian security, political economics, strategy, foreign policy, and economic statecraft. Published extensively in leading academic journals, he's the author of 4 books, including the best-selling Follow the Leader, Lose the Region, Charting a Canadian Strategy for the Asia-Pacific with the UBC Press. Welcome to Polaris Live, Professor Reeves. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, Sarwar. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the invitation.
Now, I wanted to start off by asking you that you're an expert on the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, and you're signaling that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization on NATO should not be getting involved in Asia. Why?
Well, first of all, let me premise all of my comments by saying I do work for the U.S. government. All the comments that I'll make today are my own and not a reflection of U.S. policy, of course. Listen, I think my cynicism or my concern around NATO's intended expansion, or the rhetoric around the intentions that NATO members have of engaging in some degree in the Indo-Pacific, is really rooted in this idea of extra-regional powers being involved in Asia. That goes back to some of the Indo-Pacific strategies that came out in 2018, 2019, starting in Europe, for example, the Netherlands, France, Germany, the European Union came out with its own Indo-Pacific strategy. And I've always just been a little bit wary of the idea of European powers seeing the security situation in Asia as something that needs to be managed, and managed by an external actor, and managed by an external actor that has a colonial history in the Asia-Pacific region. It's always struck me as a little bit chauvinistic, a little bit presumptuous that, for example, the Netherlands is going to come into a region where we have some of the world's most, I think, sophisticated emerging economies, huge population center, and they're going to somehow interdict in a way that brings stability to a region that is otherwise unstable. I mean, the underlying assumptions in that are, first of all, that it's an unstable region. And I think that recent history would point to the fact that despite there are obviously serious concerns around potential security flashpoints, overall, Asia's been relatively stable for the last several decades. So challenging that underlying assumption, does Europe need to be involved to secure a region that is already secure? And then whether or not Europe actually has the ability to enter into the region in any significant way, whether it's in terms of their norms and values, or whether it's in terms of their material assistance. So this is really where my concerns around external intervention in Asia started, and I wrote about this in my book. But then, NATO obviously is a whole different kettle of fish, right? It is a military security organization, institution. So the idea that there would be some sort of collective Euro-Atlantic security involvement in the Indo-Pacific is even, I think, a step further than my concerns around just an individual European state coming into the region. And obviously, the kind of center of gravity of all of this is the partnership with the United States, which is a security provider both in the Indo-Pacific and Europe, but not an unproblematic one at certain moments and times.
But Jeffrey, if I may, NATO says that its 32 European member states are deeply affected by China.
Yeah.
China's interactions with the Indo-Pacific countries. So it has to project its military muscle in the region.
Right.
Give any credence to that?
Well, I mean, sure. China is a significant global, I think, political and economic force. It has the ability to affect issues outside of the Asia Pacific region. And in this instance, of course, I think the NATO member states are speaking specifically with respect to China's engagement with Russia, which they see as directly enabling Russia to continue its war in Ukraine. So the linkage, I think, in terms of the security kind of concept is what's happening in Europe is being fed by developments in the Indo-Pacific. Therefore, NATO has to be involved in the Indo-Pacific. The challenge there, though, is if you look at it in terms of if you define security in this kind of broad sense, really what you're doing is introducing this concept of what I think, the economist Adam Tooze would call a polycrisis, right? Security is now not just the hard war security type, military security, a traditional definition that we see in Ukraine, but it's become, linked to trade. It's become linked to investment and financing. And then all of a sudden, China's regular trade patterns with Russia, which are not insignificant in 2023, the two states had a bilateral trade of around 280 billion. So this is a big trading relationship. All of a sudden, this becomes a security issue that NATO feels it needs to intervene in order to somehow address. I mean, it's problematic because once you start that creep outwards, right, where does it stop? Does China's diplomatic engagement, for example, constitute a security threat that NATO needs to counter through some sort of indirect or direct means? So, yeah, I think obviously that's the issue at hand is the concern over China. And we've seen that now in a number of communiques going back at least a couple of years now where NATO talks about China as fundamentally being a challenge to ongoing security interests,
Right.
to all of their security and values, a challenge to the rules-based order. So these are, really fluffy concepts. And if this is how we're going to determine who's a security partner and who's a security, challenger, it's going to be very challenging in the future not to have states that are inside and states that are outside of some sort of NATO-type relationship.
In this small discussion that we've just started to have, I'm reminded of the fact that the United States and China have managed, after some months of negotiations and standoffs, to actually restart direct communications with high-ranking officials from both militaries. And it's a very fragile agreement, as I understand it. Do you think that that NATO's plans ought to kind of take a cautious view of getting involved as these China-US plans proceed?
Well, I think this is the other aspect of why NATO needs to think about its future, and in particular, if its future is expansionary, right? If it says, "Hey, we're no longer a Euro-Atlantic organization. We want to have our fingers in any security issue that touches on the European theater, which includes, anything that's happening in China or the Indo-Pacific, in particular because we already have partners there that are part of the U.S. alliance system." The point being, right now is a specific moment in time, and there are leaders across NATO countries, across the Indo-Pacific, in Japan, in South Korea, in the United States with President Biden, who are far more internationalist than possibly the next generation of leaders that will replace them, right? We've now just seen that former President Trump has announced J.D. Vance as his vice president candidate. We know that Mr. Vance has a far different view on the value of the U.S. Relationship with NATO than the current administration does. If there's a change in American administration, there could fundamentally be a change in U.S. Support for NATO going forward. What would that mean if all of a sudden we've taken, at this period in time, significant steps to deepen our partnerships with states like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea, the Indo-Pacific Four, for right. NATO, these partner states? What happens if you make these inroads and then all of a sudden you have, the major military kind of, again, center of gravity, the United States and NATO, redefine how it's going to engage with NATO and perhaps even with China. All of these things point to an uncertain future that should be part of the calculation at this moment in time about whether NATO wants to take those steps moving forward.
You brought up the points of, the budgetary issues, and I think we need to talk a little bit about that. It's been 2 years since this Russia-Ukraine war, right? And Russia, as I recall, has a defense budget that is roughly a third of the United States. One. Two, France alone has a defense budget that is marginally smaller than Russia's.
Right.
So if you were to add France and Italy and Britain, I mean, they would so exceed Russia's defense budget. So why is it that with all of these assets, economic assets, NATO really has not been able to do anything to prevent Russia, in its fight against Ukraine?
Yeah. I mean, add to that the fact that you now have Poland coming out and saying that it expects to spend upwards of 5% of its GDP on defense in coming years, right? There's no insignificant amount of defense spending that's coming from NATO member states. I think, fundamentally, this has been about the United States' role within NATO as being essentially the point of the spear, right? In terms of organizing the overall kind of military structure, of being the leader in NATO in terms of military procurement. The U.S. defense industry has largely been the one that's been stockpiling or moving goods into Ukraine. Europe lacks, I think, fundamentally a proportionate defense industrial kind of base in order to pick up some of that kind of production that's going to be necessary to provide ongoing support to Ukraine. It's certainly, I think, identified this moment in time as a driver necessitating the development of those kind of European-wide defense industrial kind of structures, but they're not fundamentally there. A lot of the procurement that takes place across Europe comes from the United States. The United States is the largest, I think, provider of actual military weapons to Ukraine. It's just the structure of the organization has been like this for so long, and this is one of the the critical parts of the debate around how sustainable is NATO without the United States. The defense spending's there, the money is potentially there, although there's still some NATO members like Canada that can't make that 2% spending floor. Now they're calling it a floor, right? Not a ceiling. This is the minimum expectation of NATO member states is to contribute around 2%. But long term, it's just about the sustainability of the organization without the United States.
Let me pursue the budget issue a little more. Some of our viewers may not know that NATO doesn't have a standing military force. It doesn't have a budget to pay countries to send soldiers around the world. That when a NATO member country decides it's going to send ships or planes or soldiers, it also agrees to pick up the cost for all of that, right? So if NATO's having so much trouble in the support with a neighbor, Russia, is it realistic to think that it can support any kind of a meaningful force that would make a difference to the power balance in the Indo-Pacific?
The short answer is no. No. I mean, again, this is one of the issues with NATO. All right, the Indo-Pacific is not just one of the most complicated security environments in terms of outstanding issues and architecture. It's also probably the region with the highest level buy-in in terms of actually being able to make a significant change to the overall strategic kind of environment. Right? There are major players in this region that are spending, proportionate amounts more than European states. I mean, China, the world's second largest spender in terms of military expenditures per annum, right? And every year we see that growing again. Japan, a very, very significant military in and of its own self. South Korea,
Right.
some of the world's largest navies are in Asia and in Southeast Asia. The Australians, obviously very capable. So there are really serious, significant, sophisticated actors within the Indo-Pacific that won't be deterred by the presence of a British frigate or a French destroyer coming through the South China Sea. China at this point fields the region's largest navy for sure, and in some ways the world's largest navy. We're looking at upwards of 350 plus naval vessels just in the Indo-Pacific theater. I mean, that's substantially larger than what the United States can bring to bear. Now, the U.S. can offset that somewhat with its allies and partners in the region. If you add the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Australians' capabilities, then you see a little bit more of a the advantage once again swinging towards the U.S. alliance system. But again, significantly, I wouldn't anticipate any meaningful, significant change in terms of the regional balance of power through a NATO intervention, for the reasons that you say. What are the material means that they can bring to bear? We already have the United States with its extended deterrence in the region, so you already have a strategic kind of level, military capability. Another nuclear power from Europe or NATO coming into the region, is it going to really, shift the rational calculation within Beijing? Maybe, but certainly not by too much. I think this region is just so already overlaid with military capabilities, with significant military actors, not just in terms of the U.S. alliance relationships, but in terms of states that we see as adversaries, right? North Korea, Russia has its Pacific fleet that we don't often talk about, but very significant nuclear capabilities there. China, obviously developing both its conventional and non-conventional forces. Yeah, it's a region that would be very difficult for an external power, with the exception of the United States, to come in and fundamentally alter.
So, Professor Reeves, let me take a moment to remind our viewers that Polaris-Live.com is a commercial-free, viewer-supported channel. You can help us by subscribing to our YouTube channel and signing up for our newsletters at my website, Kashmeri.com, Kashmeri.com. There's no cost, and it will really help us. I would like to now turn a little bit into Indo-Pacific internal structures. As you know, ASEAN is a organization started some years ago by now 10 members, and it has managed to create a balance of power economically, talk through problems, although its defense joint commitment is barely beginning. But would a NATO involvement in that region, or plans for an involvement, kind of derail some of what ASEAN has done?
I think ASEAN would benefit to have some line of communication, obviously, with NATO. I think that there's, just as it does have a line of communication with the PRC, with China, right? I mean, strategically, ASEAN is all about finding some sort of equilibrium in the region, understanding that it has its own institutional challenges. Although absent ASEAN, there's really no regional organization that can do what it does. As you mentioned, I think ASEAN's kind of fledgling security dialogues, its political security community, they are starting to discuss significant security cooperation, in particular around areas that we would call non-traditional security. So environmental security around economics, human security, that type of illegal trade, illegal migration, human trafficking type issues, cyber, of course, AI. These are really I think critical areas. So yeah, I mean, this is an organization that will become, I think, probably more and more relevant in terms of the broader ecosystem of security dialogue and exchange. So talking to NATO is one thing. If NATO is thinking that they want to come in and provide some sort of, bulwark against regional security, that could potentially sideline ASEAN as a regional security actor. Although I'm a little bit probably cynical about that perspective as well, because I just don't think NATO can come in and provide an honest to God alternative structure in the region that's going to have the same level of legitimacy. I think fundamentally the architecture, the Western kind of centric architecture, is already in Asia, and I think that's a point I haven't made, but one that's pretty critical, right? I mean, the U.S. alliance relationship with all of its allies and partners across the Indo-Pacific region, and more importantly, the increased interconnectivity between these allies themselves. So Japan and Australia, Japan and the Philippines, South Korea and Japan and the United States on trilateralism. These are already existing, already very significant security relationships in the Indo-Pacific that do have a major impact on the way that the region is going. So I'm not entirely sure what the value proposition of then taking NATO out of the European context, superimposing it on the region, where you already have a pretty significant kind of Western-centric architecture to provide some sort of security mechanism. What exactly is that meant to accomplish, other than just linking these two theaters together in a way that is purposefully or inadvertently, let's say, but I would say probably more purposely antagonistic towards China?
Good points that you make. You have also said that the prospect of a NATO security regime jointly with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea is deeply problematic, right? I note from the South China Morning Post that Japan is now planning to spend more on its defense than at any time since the Second World War. So it seems to me these are all signals that corroborate what you're saying.
Right.
And do you see it that way?
I do. I mean, there's reporting this morning that a recent poll of South Korean, the population, upwards of 75% or so, are now advocating for South Korea to develop its own nuclear capability, understanding the challenges that are coming from North Korea, concerns over the long-term sustainability of the American commitment in the region. So, I mean, these Asian actors are becoming more capable. As you said, Japan is committed to increasing its defense spending. I think there's a little bit of a challenge around that with its ability to actually identify, pots of money internally where they can reallocate those to defense spending. But certainly, we've seen an increase in defense spending across the region, from Indonesia, from Malaysia, from Singapore, from China. All of these states are committed to developing more modern, more capable forces in order to advance their own national interests, but also to understand that, everyone has to pull their weight to provide some sort of degree of stability within the region. And that includes China, right? I mean, China has defense relationships with most of the states in the Indo-Pacific, absent, of course, some of the more significant American allies like Japan and South Korea, although there have been instances in the past and probably in the future, probably ongoing now, where there are defense dialogues happening informally between senior officials. But I would just say, it's a region that we need to try to identify areas and opportunities to de-escalate, right, rather than to escalate. And I think if you have the region's most significant political, economic, and in some ways security power, and that is China, if it's looking around and saying, like, listen, don't introduce another layer of complexity into this already complex environment, because number one, it doesn't accomplish anything, and number two, it's just provocative, and it feeds into this narrative that the Western community or world is intent on somehow containing China or responding to China, right? And that's not just the Chinese perspective. Across Southeast Asia, many states are very sympathetic to that point of view, where they do say, we do, of course, have security concerns with respect to the PRC. But at the same time, is the solution to have the United States and its European allies and partners come in and try to introduce some, additional means to isolate China within a region that it's just deeply, deeply, deeply integrated in, both economically, politically, and socially. I think that Asia is already a fixed regional entity. becoming more and more integrated across trade, across investment, across people and people ties. It is really becoming a tighter, more close-knit relationship between these states. And I think at this point in time, at this moment, it's a bit baffling why we're even having a discussion that declining European powers, and I don't mean that dismissively, I just mean that in terms of proportionality, are looking around and saying, where else can we become involved globally in order to do what? To re-establish global leadership? Well, that's not going to happen. I mean, any forecasting foresight that looks out past 2030 will say the region's largest economies are going to be in Asia. They're not going to be in Europe.
Well,
and we've already seen by purchase power parity, right? The
yes.
Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific is like upwards of 50% of global GDP, while Europe continues to drop further and further down.
But now, Jeffrey, I'm going to leverage your position as a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School, the Naval War College. Navies and naval strategy has always been very far-reaching.
Mm-hmm.
And the Navy has always thought, because of its role of what's happening around the world. And so I'm going to try to tie everything we've talked together by asking you that, do you think that there is a long-term solution to this Ukraine-Russia issue? And in fact, the Russia-European states issue, if Russia is not included in some way in the European Security Compact. And I say this because there was a time when there was a Russian quasi-ambassador to NATO, Dmitry Rogozin, who I spent 2 or 3 hours with discussing this issue, but that whole thing collapsed because it didn't work. But now I'm asking you a very broad question, expanding the optic, and what do you think?
I think that, I mean, there's a couple ways to answer this. I mean, the first is, like, we're now in the third year of this war, and I mean the approach by NATO and the Western states has been to isolate Russia, to either compel or coerce other states across the region in places like Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, to either sign up to the Western approach to Russia, which includes isolating it politically, economically, and of course in terms of its kind of broader security issues. Or, I mean, and fundamentally, like, where are we? We're at a position where on a daily basis, Ukraine continues to lose territory, despite the fact that, over $100+ billion of support have come from Europe and the United States. And we saw a recent peace summit led by President Zelensky that I think didn't accomplish anything significantly, partly because, of course, Russia wasn't involved. And because Russia wasn't involved, the Chinese said they weren't going to be involved. And the Chinese looked around the region and said, no one should be involved if Russia's not going to be involved. And this became obviously, an issue. So, I mean, I guess my point here is, listen, we've tried not engaging with Russia and not looking at Russian security concerns. I mean, you could argue whether or not they're legitimate or illegitimate. That's almost at this point not a strategic discussion as much as it is ideological, whether or not you actually recognize that adversary states can have legitimate security concerns. So either we isolate them completely, which hasn't worked, or we find some way to engage with them while holding our nose and understanding that this isn't the ideal situation, but in order to find some sort of an off-ramp to the conflict, in order to de-escalate, we have to recognize that there's more than just one party. And at this moment in time, the momentum from a tactical perspective, from an operational perspective, and from a strategic perspective, sits with Moscow. Whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, again, depends on your perspective. But it is a reality on the ground, and it's one that I think more and more warfighters, not just in the United States, but across, I think, Europe, across Asia, are realizing and saying, what we have right now is not sustainable. And if what we've built right now is predicated on the idea of complete isolation of Russia and non-negotiation as a matter of our, of strategy, then I think perhaps it's time to reconsider and find find it in our strategic interests, as much as it might be distasteful, to look to Moscow and find what terms could it come to end the conflict, because ultimately it's the human cost that is so significant on the Ukraine side and on the Russian side, right? These are people that are going and fighting and dying. So if we can find a way to stop that, I think fundamentally that's a positive outcome.
Well, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there, Professor Reeves. We've run out of time, so I really want to thank you again for taking the time from God knows your heavily committed schedule to join us on Polaris Live. I hope you'll come back and see us again.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a great opportunity, great conversation, wonderful topics, and so pleased to have this opportunity to speak with you. Thank you.
And thank you to our viewers from around the world. Please join us again for our next program as Polaris Live continues to explore the most consequential relationship in the world between the United States and China and its impact in the world. Until then, goodbye.